Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. North Korea is doubling down on its already close ties with China and Russia. Are there ways to impose costs on North Korea's bad behavior and prod China to play a constructive role? Today, we discuss what can be done with our expert panelists.
Корейская Народно-Демократическая Республика – важный партнер России, с которым нас связывает общая граница и богатая история сотрудничества.
Nobody should be helping Mr. Putin kill more Ukrainians. But the fact that he's reaching out to North Korea.
In the studio with me, Mr. Anthony Ruggiero, Senior Director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Ruggiero was the National Security Council Senior Director for Counterproliferation and Biodefense during the Trump administration. He was also NSC Director for North Korea. Also joining us, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin previously served as a Senior Director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Dr. Cronin, in the past weeks, North Korea has fired various kinds of missiles, ICBM, SRBM, and cruise missiles. And cruise missiles can top nuclear weapons and travel 1,000 to 2,000 kilometers. And it can be more dangerous for South Korea, given the proximity with North Korea and the fact that the cruise missiles are optimized for precision strikes. Do you think it is a problem that the cruise missiles are not banned by UN Security Council, just like as in ballistic missiles?
Well, I think it's a problem that North Korea keeps developing these long-range cruise missiles, the air-breathing missiles that can fly under the radar, so to speak, strike within the first island chain, so hit all U.S. bases and friends and allies nearby, and pose another trajectory of threat to U.S. and U.S. allied forces. Obviously, the United Nations could be part of a solution, but I wouldn't think banning them would stop North Korea from doing it. When you think about how Russia and the United States failed to be able to preserve the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, for instance, because of Russia's sort of cheating on that treaty, it just shows you how difficult it is because of competing interests in military plans. So North Korea's plans call for building up their weapons across the board. They want to be an equal power with the United States, and they want to be able to pose a sort of a permanent threat. So I don't think any ban, unfortunately, is going to help at this point.
Now, Mr. Ruggiero, as long as North Korea's missiles do not pose a direct threat to the neighboring countries, would the rhetorical condemnation the way to go? The UN Security Council statements that criticize North Korea's launches as it fails to stop North Korea from further provocations, isn't it effectively just issuing immunity to North Korean missile launches?
Right. I would just say that they are a direct threat to the U.S. allies and our partners in the region. This is North Korea's effort to be able to develop these weapons so that they could continue to coerce and in the future coerce South Korea and Japan. You know, the United Nations Security Council right now is a lost cause. I think that the administration is wasting their time by calling these meetings and then just issuing strongly worded statements. Right now, what the administration needs to do is implement the UN sanctions through U.S. sanctions, and we're not doing that. So this is why we're seeing North Korea is very comfortable with the status quo. They can parade all of these missiles, they can parade all these new material, because they know that the U.S. is not doing anything about it.
Dr. Cronin, since last year, North Korea has launched more than 100 missiles and has focused on tactical nuclear weapons. And the threshold for using strategic nuclear weapons is higher than the tactical nuclear weapons. So do you think the US and South Korea's nuclear consultative group should focus on using tactical nuclear weapons in response to North Korean threats?
Sure, but also ICBMs. I mean, they've done 8 ICBM tests, including 2 successful solid food tests this year with the Hwasong-18. But on the tactical nuclear threat, you're right. This could be conceived as something that might be used on the battlefield more easily than an ICBM. And I think it is part of this extended deterrence discussion that is now deeply entrenched between Seoul and Washington and is moving forward. They've had the first meeting of the Nuclear Consultative Group. We've seen the strategic assets sort of collect and accumulate around the Korean Peninsula, starting with the SSGN, the SSBN, and now an attack submarine. I think this is all part of deterring any use of weapons, especially tactical nuclear weapon use.
Mr. Ruggiero, the SSBN, the Ohio-class nuclear ballistic missile submarine, was deployed to South Korea as part of the U.S. extended deterrence over South Korea. And House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCaul said in an interview that the deployment of the submarine is to deter aggression not only from North Korea but also from China. Do you agree with that?
I think that's right. I think it's important for the administration to make clear to the Kim family to begin with that any use of their nuclear weapons will end the regime. I think that the U.S. Defense Secretary has said that, and those submarines and other items that are military items that are shoring up the deterrence with South Korea and North Korea is what would be used with China as well. And so I think the Chinese are watching. I think the Chinese are probably worried about the amount of military items that are visiting South Korea. And so for them, the quickest way to do that is to, stop helping North Korea essentially with their sanctions evasion and their prohibited activities.
Dr. Cronin, Chairman McCaul also said that nuclear-armed submarine is to deter and bottleneck up North Korea in the event of Chinese conflict with Taiwan. Does this mean that South Korea will inevitably be involved in Taiwan contingency? And can the United States overwhelm China without the help of South Korea and Japan?
Well, President Yoon has said that Taiwan is an international crisis and that Korea would be involved in that. It would be a global crisis if it happened. So I think he's even intimated that it's impossible for Korea to secure South Korea while there's a Taiwan war going on or crisis. But whether the submarines are used in that scenario is a different situation. And those submarines are not based in South Korea. So I wouldn't necessarily connect the submarine visits to South Korea to Korea's automatic role in a Taiwan contingency. I would also note, however, that in the Japan Defense White Paper that just came out, they talk about the Southwest Islands and Yonaguni, the most southwestern island, as part of the very front line of a Taiwan contingency, meaning Japan now is essentially saying, we don't think we can stand aside if there's a Taiwan contingency. I think that comes very close to pulling, Korea into a regional crisis if China made the catastrophic miscalculation and tried to use force to unify Taiwan.
Mr. Ruggiero, tensions are running high around Korean Peninsula with North Korea's continued provocations and alliance show of force. Is there a chance that this could grow into accidental escalation? And during the late 19th century, Korea was the battleground for superpowers. How can South Korea glean lesson from that experience and not again become a scapegoat to the rising tensions in the region in terms of balancing diplomacy between the superpowers or strengthening its alliance with the United States?
If there's a miscalculation, it'll probably be on the North Korean side. That would be my guess. I mean, because the South Koreans and the Americans and even Japan are the ones that are trying to reach out to North Korea. They are the ones that are trying to set up hotlines and conversations either on the military side or diplomatic side. When we talk about the Taiwan crisis and potentially China invading Taiwan, the thing I worry about is what will Kim Jong-un think about that. And so certainly there's a question of what South Korea and Japan's role will be in a potential China-Taiwan conflict, but what happens if North Korea sees that as an opportunity, again, to your point of a miscalculation on their part, to either go south or to increase the coercion on South Korea and Japan. That's where I think the miscalculation possibility comes from.
And when it comes to South Korea surrounded by superpowers, is it South Korea learning from its past experience? Is it better for South Korea to balance between the superpowers or strengthen its alliance with the United States?
I mean, perhaps 5 or 6 years ago they could balance. Maybe when the U.S. had a different China policy, but I think now it's the time for choosing, and it seems that South Korea President Yoon is choosing the side of democracy, the side of those who want to have their freedom of expression and not be coerced by a Chinese government that is more interested in getting the things that they want and not really caring about what the other countries decide. That's really the choice that's for a lot of the countries in that region, and many of them I would argue, are interested in having the U.S. more presence in the region to bolster that. And I think for the United States, it's really a question of, can we be everywhere at once? Can we be the true global power that we need to be, or as some, unfortunately, here in DC and elsewhere, are arguing that we should be a regional power, whether that region be Europe or Asia. I think there's enough of us that still believe that America is a global power, and we should be.
Well, South Korea cannot be neutral and separate. It is inextricably involved in this sort of global and regional geopolitics and strategic competition. At the same time, South Korea also understands the horrors of war. They experienced the war. We fought with them as we remember the 70th anniversary that stopped the fighting but not the war. And I think, therefore, the lesson for South Korea is maintain ties to China, try to not be overly dependent on their economy, but build up your defenses and strengthen your alliances and your partnerships, your new partnerships, including with Japan and Australia and other countries. I think exactly what the Yoon administration is doing, frankly, is drawing on the right lessons.
Now, Dr. Cronin, Russian and Chinese officials stood shoulder to shoulder with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un during the military parade marking the 70th anniversary of the end of the Korean War. The United States said that China and Russia should play a constructive role. At a time when UN Security Council is seeking another round of sanctions on North Korea, is China and Russia effectively neutralizing those efforts?
More than neutralizing, they're basically trying to overturn the UN sanctions, the U.S. and South Korean interpretation of the war, any unlawful activity that North Korea is engaged in to try to build nuclear weapons and ICBMs and tactical nuclear weapons. All of those are essentially being supported now physically by Minister Shoigu, the defense minister of Russia, and Politburo member Li of China, by showing up at this parade and watching the drones fly around that look a lot like MQ-9 American drones, watching the ICBMs parade by. So this is making a mockery of the United Nations, and North Korea loves it. North Korea's Kim knows that this is a blank check for him to continue to provoke.
Dr. Cronin, Kim Jong-un brazenly showed off ICBM and other weapons banned by the UN Security Council to Defense Minister Shoigu of Russia, which is the permanent member of the UN Security Council. Is this a vivid visualization that no further sanctions are possible on North Korea's further provocations?
Well, as Anthony suggested, no further sanctions from the UN Security Council because of Russia and China. That doesn't mean there can't be sanctions. It just means they're going to be limited to countries that are the law-abiding countries like the United States and South Korea and Japan. That doesn't go far enough because North Korea is depending upon unlawful countries and revisionist powers like China in particular for its economy. But nonetheless, back to your point, I think Russia's, though, not just busting the sanctions here, they're also, frankly, strengthening the supply chain between the North Korean military arsenal and what was the Wagner Group, now under new management, under the defense ministry, no longer under Prigozhin, who's been sidelined and is outside of the Ukraine war. That's what people are not talking about, but that's what's actually happening right now. North Korea provided arms to the Wagner Group in the fall. That was when Prigozhin was running Wagner Group. Now, Shoigu is there with his letter from Putin to say, I'm your man. I'm continuing the supply chain. We need to win this war in Ukraine.
Now, on that point, Mr. Ruggiero, wouldn't the closer alignment between North Korea and Russia translate to more hard currency for North Korea? And the North Korean state media said that Shoigu and Kim Jong-un discussed mutual interest in the area of defense. And what Dr. Cronin just said, wouldn't that mean, presumably, more military trade between North Korea and Russia?
Well, absolutely. And when you think about this, we only have ourselves to blame here. The White House said that this relationship with Russia, between North Korea and Russia, started in November of last year. We haven't done any real sanctions against North Korea and particularly Russia for this relationship. It would not be hard to break this up and to increase the pressure there. I mean, it's time to get serious. This administration has been in office for 2.5 years, and the sanctions are woefully inadequate. Certainly that goes back to 2018 when they first started to atrophy, but the time is running out. I mean, if we're comfortable with North Korea in this space and the status quo, that's fine too, if that's what this administration has made the decision on. I'm not comfortable with it. I think there's a simple way to reverse this and at least have Kim think twice about supporting Russia in its war in Ukraine. Not all hope is not lost. It's only lost if we choose not to use the tools that are available to us.
But the Biden administration did sanction members of the Wagner Group and also middlemen between the Wagner Group and North Korea.
Right. Those are very minimal activities. I mean, we need to get at the heart. When you look at this administration's approach to North Korea sanctions, whether it's with Russia or with China or elsewhere, whether it's on the coal transfers, on the overseas laborers, when you look at those networks, it's clear that they're only going after one part of that. They talk about in their press releases that North Koreans are working with Chinese companies, presumably Chinese individuals and Chinese banks, some of whom have probably relationships with the United States. They are choosing not to go after those. To me, that is not a serious approach. We only had a serious approach from 2016 to 2018. We can go back to that pretty quickly. It's just a question of whether this administration is willing to expend the resources. I know that China is a complicated issue, but Russia is engaged in a war with one of our partners and allies that we are supporting, and we are choosing not to end that relationship using the tools that are available to us.
You were at the White House at the 2018?
I was, yeah.
So this is the time when you were at the White House that there was only the serious sanctions activity against North Korea.
That's correct.
And those policy recommendations that you just laid out, did you lay out those recommendations to the senior people in the White House, and what was the reaction?
I think most people are aware that my views on North Korea have been very consistent, and so I certainly made those views known. But as we all know, the president was the one calling the shots on North Korea policy, and he took a chance working with Kim Jong-un. I think that at the end of the day, when Kim was not serious with Hanoi, we should have gone back to what worked and what got President Trump there. And for some reason, he chose not to do that. I think that's a question for him.
Then your recommendations essentially failed.
Well, not my recommendations. They were just not taken. Yeah.
Dr. Cronin, do you agree that U.S. should revert back to strong sanctions on North Korea after the fall of the Hanoi diplomacy?
Well, it's a great question. Anthony's got a lot of expertise on this area. I think the problem is, and he hinted at it when he said China's a complicated question. Yeah, the global economy is a complicated question. U.S. China are both integral to the global economy. So it's very difficult to threaten draconian financial sanctions on all of things China and not lose our allies and partners, not disrupt Wall Street and Hollywood. And so we have constraints. We have limits on our power. So it's not that we can't do that. I agree with Anthony's diagnosis of the bad guys and what they're doing. I just don't think that actually can be implemented in any way, which is why it's not being implemented. We may have to go back there. I mean, Anthony may be right. We may be pushed back into there with a threat. For instance, a tactical nuclear weapon use. I think, yeah, we probably would be back there. And he's saying, make that judgment now. Don't wait for that to happen. That's a fair argument. But I think the larger political argument, the larger economic argument is we're still trying to build the floor under a U.S.-China relationship. And I think that's why that's the overriding policy concern in Washington right now, not Kim Jong-un's nuclear threat. We can say that could be wrong. We can argue over that. But that's the priority right now.
But don't you think the United States need to apply shock therapy to China, to move China to help with North Korea? If China is comfortable where it is at the status quo, doesn't the United States and South Korea need to apply some kind of shock therapy?
We are strong, but China is strong and big too. And it's recognition of that great power strength that's existing right now that should cause us to be very careful about how we apply shock treatment. Remember, when Russia went to apply shock treatment to a little neighbor in Ukraine, it got shocked that its 3-day special military operation wasn't so special. China is a great power. We just have to be very careful about this. I want us to win on this fight too, but I don't want to bring down the house. I don't want to bring down the global economy and all of our allies with it.
Mr. Ruggiero, the G7, EU, and South Korea, Australia, New Zealand sent a letter to China to stop North Korea from evading sanctions using Chinese waters. Now, other than those activities specified in the letter, VOA has investigated and reported many instances of Chinese involvement in the ship-to-ship transfers near North Korean waters. Chinese vessels were visiting North Korean ports, and North Koreans were buying used Chinese vessels. And UN asked VOA to share this information. This is a public information that U.S. government can find if it has the will. We don't see any major activities from the U.S. government on this front. Why do you think U.S. government is not actively tracking down and punishing North Korean such activities?
It's a great question. I mean, it seems like they're more willing to write an angry worded letter. They probably pat themselves on the back and say that they've done something with that, but we know that we've engaged China for years on this subject. I mean, just on what Patrick said, I agree that we probably don't want to go to the red zone with China on North Korea sanctions evasion, but being in the zero zone where we're doing nothing is unacceptable as well. And my point in the 2016-2018 timeframe is that we started dismantling key Chinese networks and then in private made clear to China that there was more to come. And the response we saw is that the Chinese actually started to implement the sanctions that they agreed to. I think, ship-to-ship transfers is another area that we could do more on. But to me, it's when we're talking about deterrence on the military side, a little bit of deterrence on the sanctions evasion side too, and make clear to China that they just can't keep doing this with no consequences. And, hopefully we don't get to the point where we have to threaten Chinese banks.
Regarding those Chinese institutions, has the secondary boycott ever been properly applied on the Chinese facilitators to North Korean sanctions evasion? Former high-level North Korean defectors tell VOA that they shared information with the U.S. government regarding those Chinese institutions.
Well, we've done it before. As I mentioned, Dandong Hongxiao, we went after Bank of Dandong. We've gone after, the thing that distinguishes that time period, as I noted before, is that when you look at the network, we didn't just go after one person in the network. We went after a node. We made sure there was no contagion in terms of the global economy. But then just as important as the public message is the private message from Treasury to, Treasury in China, making clear that there's more where that came from. And those banks, frankly, the Chinese banks, want access to the U.S. financial system, and they will go through their transactions and make it harder for North Korea to do these transactions. That's all we're looking for. I don't think we're going to get to a zero in where those transactions are happening. We're trying to just make it harder. Right now, there's really no problem for North Korea. So that's why they feel comfortable doing what they're doing, selling arms to Russia and doing all of these things that, if we asked us 3 years or so years ago, we would have never said they would be doing this because they'd be focused on their own programs.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Dr. Cronin, Mr. Ruggiero, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.